Yeah, thank you all so much for attending today. So I'm using a really cool new product from Google and the World Resources Institute called Dynamic World. And I want you all to know first that there will be an introduction to the Dynamic World dataset here at 5 o'clock. So, yeah, no trouble. So this talk will be like an application of it, and then the introduction will be at 5. Oh, thank you. So environmental models based on land cover data, they are common in many fields, including like atmospheric science, hydrology, and biogeochemistry. And traditionally, the readily available land cover data sets for these models to use have either reflected like growing season conditions only, or will be available at an annual time step. And now we have this new dynamic world product that I mentioned from Google and WRI, and you can access it from Google Earth Engine. And it now enables modelers to use seasonal land cover data, or even land cover data like as frequent as 5-day intervals in their models. So it really like increases the capabilities for modelers to understand how land cover is affecting the outputs of their models. And however, for this product to advance with modeling, we need to understand like what are the differences between land cover data that's estimated from the growing season and the non-growing season. So yeah, here for example, in the lower left-hand corner, we have like a mixed residential area near Washington, D.C. And we're just looking at like the dynamic world data. We can see during the growing season, there's this arm of green vegetation that extends into the red like residential area. However, in the image on the right, the non-growing season, we see that like that wasn't classified when the trees lost their leaves, and it became, I can imagine, hard to differentiate the forest from the residential area. So our research, we asked, how do hydrologic and water quality models, in particular, respond to growing versus non-growing season land cover inputs, which we got from Dynamic World. And we investigated this question using 3 cases, from like kind of simple models to more complex models. So in the simplest, we had predictive water quality models of specific conductance for 37 temperate National Park Service watersheds in the Washington, D.C. area. And then for our second case, we used the soil and water assessment tool, hydrologic and water quality model, which is one of the most used water quality models in the world. And for this case, we tested this model in an ungauged watershed. And then finally, for our most complex case, we used the soil and water assessment tool, hydrologic model, calibrated at the daily time step, and developed using either the growing season or the non-growing season land cover data to see how the model would behave, or how the models would be compared to each other after calibration. So when looking at the dynamic world land cover data and our temperate Washington, D.C. area watersheds, yeah, we found that in general, there could be higher amounts of tree cover classified during the growing season, but then more built, also we can say urban areas that were classified during the non-growing season. And yeah, this chart on the left shows that these differences among our watersheds, they were typically like 5, maybe 10% of watershed area would have these differences in the classifications. And the chart on the right shows that for like one watershed that we investigate further, that there was a seasonal cycle in the land cover estimates where like throughout the time period of available data, there would be more built area in the non-growing season than in the growing season. So for our first case, our like regression models for specific conductance with our like our urban land use or land cover on the x-axis and the specific conductance like an indicator of kind of overall water quality on the y-axis. We found that when we fit these models either with growing season or non-growing season data from Dynamic World or another data set like the National Land Cover data set for perspective. Like all the models somewhat comparably predicted specific conductance off of land cover with similar slopes and performances. So we found that, yeah, you could use, at least in this instance, the different seasons of land cover data in these simple regression models. Now for our second case, our soil and water assessment tool, a water quality model for our ungauged watershed. Yeah, we found that the outputs of this model, yeah, could be pretty sensitive to the land cover data that is input into it. So, yeah, for instance, when we used a swap model with the non-growing season Dynamic World data, yeah, we found that there was more surface runoff and also like predictions of nutrient yields for soluble phosphorus and nitrate when using the non-growing season Dynamic World data than with the growing season data. And the reason for this was, yeah, this watershed we investigated, there were 8% more built area and 16% less forest cover in the non-growing season Dynamic World data compared to the growing season. So our swap water quality model basically interpreted this as, oh, there are more urban areas, so there must be more runoff and pollution. And finally, for our third case, the most complex, we found that our soil and water assessment tool hydrologic models, that when they're all calibrated separately with the different land cover season inputs, that we could achieve similar performance for simulating daily stream flow by adjusting model parameters. And we used like some common model performance metrics, which a couple we listed here, such as the like the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency, that were pretty comparable whether a model was calibrated with growing or non-growing season data. And this chart on the right shows how the calibrated models with different seasons of land cover data pretty similarly simulated some like spring floods back in 2016. And the reason these models were able to achieve comparable performance was because like each calibration, like each instance, calibrated to different, or I guess optimized model parameters differently. So one parameter, for example, that was optimized differently in the model depending on the land cover input was the like the runoff curve number parameter, which basically like adjusts the swap model to simulate more or less runoff during a rainstorm. And yeah, it's important to note that even though like these models achieve similar performance for simulating like this data set, that if we were to apply the models now to a like a change in climate or even a change in land cover, since they now have different optimized parameters, they may like simulate changes differently. So yeah, the implications of this research, first, we found that there can be seasonal cycles in land cover estimates. And second, we found that like environmental models for hydrology and water quality could respond differently to different seasons of land cover data that are input. Third, within reason, like calibration of these models could realign the stream flow outputs, but lead to different optimized parameter values for the models, depending on which season of Dynamic World land cover was inputted into them. Yeah, and finally, we think these findings of the like the seasonal variation, again land cover estimates, that definitely warrants further investigation with models like not just for hydrology and water quality that we looked at, but also in other fields that use environmental models based on land cover, such as atmospheric science, biogeochemistry, and ecology. And we would also be interested in doing this investigation in like a non-temperate watersheds. So we only examine temperate watersheds, but it'd be interesting to see how, say, like an arid or a mountainous or a tropical watershed would respond to being modeled with the different land cover seasons. Now, so finally, we would like to acknowledge the National Park Service, the National Capital Region Network, for the funding and the water quality data we used with the study. And we'd also greatly like to acknowledge the Google Geo for Environment Earth Outreach team for giving us the opportunity to present our research today, and just like the Google Earth team in general for making Dynamic World like available to us free of cost to use for research. So we are grateful for that. And one more. Oh, you're fine. So, and finally, because I said finally before, but finally, we invite you all, if you're interested in learning more about like how we use the Dynamic World near real-time land cover data, we have a preprint of our research on researchsquare.com titled Seasonal Variation and Land Cover Estimates Reveal Sensitivities and Opportunities for Environment Models. So now, thank you. That's it.